Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be reading and discussing the Metta Sutta in its entirety. This sutta comes to us from the Khuddaka Nikāya, the collection of short discourses in the Pali Canon. It is also called the Karaniyametta Sutta. Karaniya translates to what ought to be done, and Metta translates to loving kindness, compassion, or benevolence. So, the full title could be Discourse on How or What Loving Kindness Ought to Be Done. Loving kindness and compassion are some of the most important qualities that a practitioner of Buddhism ought to cultivate and perfect in the course of their practice. This text explains meditation on loving kindness and what loving kindness actually looks like in the real world. This text is also known to be recited for the purpose of warding off evil and preventing misfortune. Today, we'll be using the Thanissaro Bhikkhu translation. We hope you enjoy. This is to be done by one skilled in aims, appreciating the state of peace. Be capable, upright, and straightforward, easy to instruct, gentle and not conceited, content and easy to support, with few duties, living lightly, with peaceful faculties, astute, modest, and no greed for supporters. Do not do the slightest thing that the observant would later censure. Think, happy at rest, may all things be happy at heart. Whatever beings there may be, weak or strong, without exception, long, large, middling, short, subtle, gross, seen and unseen, living near and far away, born or seeking birth, may all beings be happy at heart. Let no one deceive another or despise anyone anywhere, or, through anger or resistance perception, wish for another to suffer. As a mother would risk her life to protect her child, her only child, even so should one cultivate the heart limitlessly with regard to all beings. With goodwill for the entire cosmos, cultivate the heart limitlessly, above, below, and all around, unobstructed, without hostility or hate, whether standing, walking, sitting, or lying down. As long as one has banished torpor, one should be resolved on this mindfulness. This is called a Brahma abiding here. Not taken with views, but virtuous and consummate in vision, having subdued greed for sensuality, one never again will lie in the womb. That was the Metta Sutta. Docs, any questions?
Several. So this is so much shorter than what we usually read that I could even go through this line by line and just go through. But before we do that, I want to highlight something that you put into the intro. That is that the sutta could also be called the Karaniya. Is it Karaniya or Naya?
Karaniya.
Karaniyametta Sutta, with Karaniya translating to what ought to be done. So it's worth noting that these are commands. This is like, hey, you do this in the sutta.
That's right.
Let's see. So, do not do the slightest thing that the observant would later censure. That's not possible without restricting the scope somewhat, because there's not one action I can think of that I couldn't find someone who would observe it and criticize it.
You bring up a really good translation point. It's actually a fantastic translation point, and it's one of the problems I have with this particular translation. This translation has some problems, but it's problems that I'm willing to deal with and kind of work around as compared to the problems of other ones. So I don't know if you wanted to get into it, but a second ago you mentioned the first line, this is to be done by one skilled in aims. Just a quick note, that means one who seeks enlightenment. Skilled in aims means that they kind of know the right way to go.
They know the right thing to aim for.
Exactly.
So, right, like that entire paragraph to start with, that whole thing is describing, somebody seeking enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that part came through clear enough to me.
So this issue of the word observant. So one of the ways to name or describe somebody who's on the path of enlightenment is somebody who is practicing the way or perfecting the way of seeing. And the reason why we say the way of seeing is because we're kind of talking about seeing into the true nature of reality exactly as it is, free from delusion and ignorance. And so, unfortunately, or maybe kind of neutrally, the actual word in Sanskrit, I believe, is darshana marga, meaning like the way of seeing, the lifestyle of learning how to see and perfecting seeing. That's the same for like using our eyeballs to see physical things in the world, but also coming to a greater understanding of the true nature of reality. So the darshana marga and the physical sense of seeing, those are kind of mixed together, and it takes one skilled in understanding context and understanding intertextuality between this sutta and other ones to see that if you see the word darsha or any variation of it, you could be looking at like the physical sense, because that's talked about in Buddhism, or you could be looking at an arhat, somebody who's a practitioner of the Buddha way. Now, in this case, this translator elected to say the observant. And observant in our English language has this kind of connotation as being wise and knowing what to look for and where to look for it. However, it doesn't have enough in it by itself to indicate that the person who's wise and knows what to look for, where to look for it, has anything to do with Buddhism. The original suggests to me that they're probably talking about a practitioner of darshana marga, somebody who's practicing the way of the Buddha. So this is kind of saying, in most simple terms, don't do anything that a Buddhist would look at you and say, that's bad. Don't do anything that the Buddha himself, or an enlightened being, an arhat or a bodhisattva or a pratyeka Buddha would say, that's bad. We censure that. So I think that this is not the worst translation. It's definitely a creative translation. And creative is good whenever you're doing holy texts, because you want to have kind of multiple meanings for every single word in the new language. Because the truth is, in the parent language, the original language, it has multiple meanings for every word. But here, it's probably better to just say, don't do anything that practitioner or seeker of the Buddha way would censure, and leave it to the reader to kind of figure out, if they want to, that the Sanskrit works differently than the English.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, creative translations can be useful like that, but in this case, it feels like that's... Like, when I think of observe, I'm just talking about sensing something. I'm not necessarily thinking of someone observant as being wise. It's just they notice things, they're perceptive. So, yeah, now that you've explained the whole thing, I would agree that there's probably a better word that could have been used there for the localization. Like, and it's important to mention localization rather than translation. We've mentioned before that since we're translating from liturgical languages, that kind of meaning is really easy to lose.
I agree completely. We should also note that we deal with this every time we read any sutta, and we say it a lot, and we should say it more and continue to say it. Translation is interpretation, and interpretation is guided by and pigeonholed sometimes by one's own particular agenda that they seek to work out with the text, and translation studies deal with this all the time. That's kind of the whole center of translation studies, is seeing how translations have had that in the past and trying to make sure they don't have it or minimize that in the future. It's not something you can ever get rid of, but it is something you can minimize if you're mindful. And I think that, in particular, some translators of this sutta, they seek to popularize it and they seek to spread it around the West because it's one of the most frequently recited suttas in Theravada Buddhism, but also even in Mahayana Buddhism. And also, it's the one that has some of the least, obviously religious stuff in it. It's got the message of, be nice all the time, and it's got the message of don't seek supporters, don't be greedy, be modest, live lightly, be content and easy to support, be easy to instruct, be gentle, etc., etc., etc. All that stuff is not really religious at all in our conventional Judeo-Christian context. And so if they can look to the original text and take away more religious stuff, then it makes it a little bit more able to be propagated in a secular fashion. Now, I've described this whole process. I don't want anyone to listen to this and think that I'm saying that this sutta has been secularized, because that's a whole different conversation. But I do think that aiming for secular translations has been an observable phenomenon in multiple translations of suttas into English, perhaps for the reason that people want to secularize Buddhism and advertise and sell it to a secularized audience who has left the Judeo-Christian context as much as they could and seek something that doesn't have the religiosity, the perceived religiosity as those things. I don't want to accuse this text or this translation or this translator of that full-throatedly. I do just want to say that we will see this more, especially as we continue to read the Pali Canon in particular. These things are translated in very neutral ways. And when I say neutral, I don't mean like objective. I mean like neutral so that they don't seem to present a religious agenda to the audience.
It's curated perhaps to lead one to the curator's view of things.
Exactly.
One could call that syncretization, and one could also call that deceptive presentation.
Exactly. And it takes someone who is observant to notice when one is happening and when the other isn't.
Right. So back to the text, the next thing, but again, that this is a thing for you to do. The command is, think happy at rest, may all beings be happy at heart. And then basically, if I were viewing this outside of the Buddhist context, I would immediately think this is a prayer.
It is, yeah. It's recited as a prayer, and it's presented in this translation and in this text kind of as a prayer or as a mantra, you might even say, a short mantra.
So all of this is fairly straightforward, basically saying, hey, we're covering every extreme here. One line here that looks interesting to me, born or seeking birth. So seeking birth here would be, I guess, beings who have recently died and are still awaiting rebirth.
That's right, yeah. And seeking in this regard is another strange presentation.
Yeah.
Whenever I read this the first time in English, and I wasn't a Buddhism studies scholar at the time, I actually thought that that meant like unborn babies. I thought that that meant like fetuses, like beings that had not been born yet but were about to be and were seeking that out. And then my interpretation of the entire prayer was, okay, clearly this comes out against abortion, for example, because it wants you to show this particular kind of compassion toward people who have not even been born yet. I've since kind of changed my interpretation and my view there, but the seeking birth thing, the verb seeking in particular in English, is the thing that sent me down that unknowing pathway. And I've since come to realize that that pathway it leads nowhere. It's not real. This seeking thing is referring to just beings who are in an intermediate phase in between, like you say, death and their next rebirth. Now, it's not only talking about people seeking their next rebirth in samsara. It could be people who are seeking their next rebirth in a pure land, or in a realm of the devas or the asuras, or the realm of the Buddhas or bodhisattvas or arhats. Any of those things, that all applies here too. So it's intermediate people who have died, but it's also people who are practicing toward this sort of enhanced rebirth, or even towards nirvana, even towards their final nirvana. Now, it's weird to say that seeking birth could be pointed towards final nirvana, because nirvana is, by definition, the absence of renewed births. But I think that applies here still, because it's sort of talking about people who just aren't where they're going yet.
Okay, I would have thought that those not seeking birth would be those who have relinquished their attachments and therefore are no longer seeking rebirth and therefore kind of going away from samsara. So I was looking at that line as born or seeking birth, and then the exception group to that would be the people who are not seeking birth because they want to get out of samsara.
The only reason I would not take that interpretation myself is because those are beings, and it says, may all beings be happy at heart. You know, you're trying to pray for everybody. But you're onto a good point there. Everybody who has not achieved nirvana yet still has at least one attachment, at least one, usually more, desire or sort of karmic tether to the world that they're in. Even if they are a fully realized Buddha, they're not deluded anymore, and they're not bogged down by ignorance, selfishness, etc., etc. But if they had fully relinquished all desire, all everything, then that would be like final nirvana. The thing that Shakyamuni Buddha, for example, was still attached to was teaching his Sangha. But you could even say that his human being, animalian survival instinct was like the last thread that had to be cut. And he still had that. And then you can look at practitioners like disciples of the Buddha, arhats, bodhisattvas, etc. Their attachment is still to the Buddha's teaching itself. Their desire is still to save all sentient beings or to attain enlightenment, attain final nirvana. And they finally do that whenever they sever that one last attachment. This refers to the idea that there are some attachments that are better than others in Buddhism. Attachment to drugs and sex and rock and roll is worse karmically than attachment to attaining enlightenment or saving all sentient beings. Both are still karmic. Both still are attachments that keep you in samsara, keep you attached to something and yoked to something, but they are different. One is quite a bit better than the other. So that's why I wouldn't say that somebody has kind of done away with seeking birth just because they've kind of committed to the path yet. I actually think that not seeking birth is a much later attainment in the path itself, possibly even at the very end of the path itself.
Okay. That's a good distinction to make then. Glad I brought it up.
Me too.
So, next thing I see that is worth talking about a bit. So, as a mother would risk her life to protect her child, her only child, even so should one cultivate the heart limitlessly with regard to all beings. So, the translation that we are looking at has a footnote here that states specifically that this image is sometimes misconstrued as saying that one should protect all beings as a mother would protect her only child. That's quoted straight from the translation, and then the short version of the full explanation is it's actually talking about that sense of benevolence is what needs to be protected. So, that's an interesting distinction. First of all, from your standpoint as a Buddhist scholar who has, criticisms of the translation we're talking about, does that footnote hold in your head as well?
It's an interpretation, and it's just as valid as the next one. I personally think that there is an attempt here going on to distinguish a Theravada stream of interpretation from a Mahayana stream of interpretation. The reason why the author, the translator, would want to make a footnote that says, we're not saying that you should protect every single being like a mother protects her only child, is because that is very much indicative of the Bodhisattva path, and the Bodhisattva path is present but not nearly as emphasized in the Theravada tradition. It's regarded as not being easily attainable for the vast majority of beings. It's something that's very rare. Bodhisattvas are actually quite rare and quite special in Theravada, and that's why there's not very many of them. That's why we don't all seek that path, because it's like to Theravada Buddhism, it's kind of like, why would we jump in the deep end of the pool whenever we're still trying to learn how to swim correctly, right? We need to focus on swimming correctly, and only those who have perfected swimming to a very, very high level, those rare beings who have done so, only they go swimming around in the deep end. So I think that the translator is trying to signal that to us, because probably if I were to step in the translator's shoes and the Theravada interpretive stream's shoes, I would say to myself that protecting all sentient beings everywhere as a mother would protect her child is a very difficult, very tall order. And it's not really entirely possible. You kind of fail at that no matter how hard you try. And so that kind of prevents you from setting yourself up for disappointment, defeat, and failure. Whenever you say, don't protect all sentient beings, that's too hard. Just protect your goodwill, because that's what you can do here and now. Now, just because I've gone on all of this Theravada stuff and told you about this stream of interpretation that I think that the translator is trying to lead us toward, I don't want that to make you think that the Mahayana tradition is as hard as they say, and that bodhisattvas are as rare as they say. And I also don't want you to think that Mahayana thinks that trying to protect all sentient beings is futile. They don't think of it that way at all. They don't think that it is nearly as rare, nearly as impossible as that. And their reasoning is a bunch of emptiness and non-self stuff that we have talked about before and can talk about in the future again. But I just want to say that I think that it is leading us in that direction towards the Theravada stream of interpretation. The other thing, too, is that the topic of this sutta in particular is not saving all sentient beings. It is metta. It is loving kindness and compassion. It's telling you how to live it, how to meditate on it, how to practice it, how to understand it. And so I think that the translator puts that in because he feels that he's read that paragraph and he thinks, oh, this is leading us off topic. People might read this and at the end think the Buddha is talking about something quite other than metta, or he's defining metta in a way that kind of seems different than he's defined it in a different part of the text or in other texts elsewhere. So he's saying, I translated it this way, but let's stay on topic. He's talking about goodwill here. He's talking about loving kindness, compassion, benevolence. You have to protect benevolence. Now that's why I come back to that specifically, because that is taken the same, whether it's Mahayana or Theravada. The interpretation here is that this sutta in particular, even Mahayana, that the Buddha is saying, protect your goodwill, protect your metta, because that's difficult, because that's something that needs to be practiced, because that is what leads to, as he says in one of these lines, Brahma abiding, being in an elevated spiritual state. So I think that that's another way to explain what's going on here.
I think that makes sense. I've often used the term the fight against nihilism, and I think that is what this sutta is ultimately getting to. The world sucks, and as we are recording this, World War III is in the process of starting in the Middle East right now. It is so hard to feel benevolence right now because humanity's making it really hard to keep that in mind right now. We're really not earning it very well at the moment. So yeah, the command that's being given here, the thing to practice here, is genuinely difficult.
It is.
And I don't need to be a monastic to tell you that.
It absolutely is. That's another good point too, is that the translator wants to steer us away from thinking that Buddhism is the same as fatalism. I have been to the temple today, and I have encountered people who have asked the question in different words of the monk there, is Buddhism the same as fatalism? And their question was specific and it had its own context and they worded it in their own way, but my interpretation of what they were really asking is Buddhism just fatalistic? Is it saying that, yes, we should aim to save all sentient beings, knowing that we cannot and knowing that we will die? in the process, and knowing that when we die, we will have not saved everybody yet, and knowing that we practice and enlighten ourselves, and perhaps enlighten others, and perhaps create better circumstances for those in our immediate vicinity, but simply cannot do it all. And also probably can't get the enlightenment that we talk about all the time. This is loaded with its own kind of skeptical baggage, right? We talked about this in a previous episode, this idea like you don't know that people around you are enlightened, and there's no really good, objective, verifiable, or falsifiable way to tell. You can ask somebody and they can say yes or no, and either answer could be equally impossible and equally possible at the same time. It's just kind of difficult to know if you know or not about other people. So there's that skeptical baggage in there, but there's also just kind of this idea that emptiness and non-self and impermanence, they lead us down a path of nihilism and fatalism and the sheer impossibility of it all. This is a particular critique of Mahayana Buddhism because the Bodhisattva path is the Mahayana. It's the Daijo in Japanese. It's the big vehicle, the greater vehicle. You have to do more in the Bodhisattva path, according to the Mahayana, than in the Arhat path. And you should do more, according to them, but doing more is more difficult. And so I think that the translator is saying what you can do to change the world around you is change yourself at least. And for you having changed yourself, the world is a different place. And he's leading you into that interpretation with this note, because if he thinks that you're reading this thinking to yourself, I have to change everyone and everything, you're going to be like, no, that's just simply impossible. I give up. I'm just going to die before I ever achieve anything like that. Right? And it changes the focus away from loving kindness and compassion at that point and turns it into this weird fatalist apocalyptic view of Buddhism that is a very alive interpretation in the West, but it's a very incorrect and very skeptical and very loaded interpretation that I think that a lot of genuine Buddhists everywhere seek to kind of correct when they can, because it just doesn't get you anywhere.
Agreed. So we already brought it up, but this is called a Brahma abiding here is an interesting turn of phrase. So basically that's a way of saying a higher spiritual state.
That's right.
Okay.
The original kind of refers to the practitioner actually going from this realm to the realm of devas where Brahma, the Indian deity, lives. And so you're abiding there in that you have figuratively improved your spiritual situation from that of a human to that of a god.
Okay. The last line that I wanted to highlight is the next one there, not taken with views. So I'm guessing that is kind of going for a non-dualistic idea there, like, not using discriminatory thinking.
That's right. Yeah, we've seen this lots before. You don't do any calculative or discriminatory mental actions. You're not taken away by opinions and perceptions and judgments and not taken with like diluted knowledge that you've come up with yourself based on faulty information or that other people have come up with based on faulty information. Instead, you are, as it says, virtuous and consummate in vision in this way of seeing, this way of understanding and seeing the true nature of reality.
All right, and ends with one never again will lie in the womb, so eventually that leads to nirvana.
That's right.
That brings it through for me. It's interesting that we got over 30 minutes of discussion on such a short sutta, but it's also like this crams a whole lot of context that requires, that maybe not requires, but invites further discussion.
I think it does. And you can pack so much into it and see that it's so popular because it's got really vivid imagery and it's got very culturally and temporally specific verbiage and use of words. And I love this one, actually. This is one of the earlier suttas that I read that kind of got me into what Buddhism is all about, because other people around me, they read it and they kind of saw like, okay, this is saying we should all be nice. Wow, every religion everywhere says that. this isn't special at all. But I just had the faintest glimmer that there was something going on kind of beneath the surface. And since having studied and since having gotten better at this, I can see there very much is. And I'm also very fascinated by the historical usage of this, which I think I've mentioned before, is it's very short to be remembered, but it's also to be recited to ward off evil. So this is one of the first indications I ever had when I was reading a sutta that a religious text was being used not for content. As scholars and kind of also in the Judeo-Christian context, it's very common that people read stuff to try and figure out what the words mean together and what they are saying should happen. And that's where a lot of the divisions and schisms and arguments and sects that developed come out of, is that textual stuff. But this is very much a ritual text where the person who's reciting it might not even know entirely what it is saying or what it means, but they know that the words themselves have some sort of salvific power against whatever misfortunes may ever come about.
I'll also say that this sutta is a lot more compact than the stuff that we've been listening to. Like, there's no list of bodhisattva names to try to memorize. There's no repeated passages or, repeating what he said in verse. There's not any narrative in this at all. So, whereas the other suttas we listen to has a lot of stuff, that's there, like, it takes a lot of space.
Yes.
Whereas here, every word is trying to be, by the standards of Buddhist sutras, this is relatively concise and dense in meaning.
It's true, and you actually find that a lot of the Pali Canon stuff is like that. And the Mahayana stuff becomes a lot longer form and a lot more flowery, descriptive, narrative even, and kind of lengthens as a result. This comes out of a collection that we haven't been into very much yet. This is from the Khuddaka Nikāya, or the collection of short discourses. Most of what we've been reading has come out of the collection of middle-length discourses or long discourses. But I think that we should get back into the Khuddaka Nikāya again sometime soon, because it does have these wonderful, almost Dharani-style suttas, which are very dense and contain a lot within them, even if they're only talking about one topic, like in this case, Mettā, loving kindness and compassion.
This is of a length that, I could conceive of actually memorizing this, whereas everything else that we've been listening to, that we've been reading, I look and it's like, well, I'm glad somebody has the dedication for memorizing and reciting this, but that's not me.
Yeah.
This is something that I could see a perfectly normal human who is, going at this at a less intense level could actually memorize.
Absolutely, yeah. It is easy to be transmitted in that regard, and it was transmitted that way early in Buddhism's history. It was very much a well-preserved oral piece of the tradition that we have now written down.
That's what I wanted to talk about. Are there any points I missed that you'd like to get to?
Nope, that takes care of it for me.
All right. In that case, this is the first time that the discussion is so much more of the recording than the recitation, but the sutta merits it. So, yeah, this was good.
I agree. I think this is a good text, and it's good to read and come back to later in life and try and see what's going on beneath the surface.
Thank you for listening to our discussion of the Metta Sutta. We will be back next week with a normal episode, so thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.